Hello.
Good evening, Dr. Brandenburg. How are you tonight? This is Michael Vera.
Oh, great, Mike. Great to be talking to you. Here, let me turn off the music here.
All right, great. So it sounds like you're just kicking back, having a good time, huh?
I am.
Well, that's good. Well, hey, welcome back to Late Night in the Midlands. And I apologize for all the rescheduling that we've had to do, but
Hey, nothing worth doing is done easily.
Oh, I'm telling you now.
If you're having difficulty doing something, it must be important.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're going to talk about tonight, I think, is very important. So a lot has happened since the last time you and I spoke. Water on Mars, and I'll say, Doctor, what say you?
Oh, well, this is only the 500th time they've discovered water on Mars, but it is now kind of official that there's liquid water on Martian surface, and that means there's life. It's a lead pipe cinch. Wherever you find liquid water on Earth, you find something alive in it.
Yeah.
So if you find liquid water on Mars, you're going to find living organisms flourishing in it.
I see, and
I think everyone understands that on an intuitive level now. I've talked to a lot of people who were kind of skeptics about the whole life on Mars business, and now a lot of them seem like they just concede, well, yeah, it looks very certain now.
Yeah, and they've known for a while, though, haven't they?
Yes, there's much other evidence for life on Mars, both past and present. There's, of course, the meteorite microfossils and magnetites, which people aren't paying any attention, but the academics have been doing trench warfare about that for the past 10 years, and the people from Houston have finally won. And by the way, realize that this is the U.S. government people from Houston, NASA Houston, who won a manned spaceflight mission. They're the ones pushing life on Mars. Also, most people don't realize, but molecular oxygen is the fourth most abundant gas in the Martian atmosphere. And the only way to make molecular oxygen under Martian conditions is to have photosynthesis. I've spoken to several scientists who have commented that, they don't want to be quoted, but they say this is indirect evidence of plant life on Mars simply because they can't explain how you would get molecular oxygen that abundant on Mars.
Right. What wouldn't they? And I'm not saying that they don't know this, so they probably would know this. But I mean, wouldn't they know? I mean, wouldn't they see signs when they're orbiting around it? Wouldn't they see signs of?
I'm sure I'm sure they've detected chlorophyll and organic compounds in some areas. They just haven't. You got to realize a lot of scientists, especially when the stakes are high, get very cautious. The brash young scientist out to save the world in the movies, that's more of an exception than the rule. Most scientists are very cautious. They're worried about tenure. They're worried about the department chairmanship. They're worried about, and they have a career, and they're far more afraid of being wrong about something important than they are about making a big discovery. So they'll be very cautious, and they will assemble overwhelming evidence of something new and important before they'll make an announcement.
Or I wonder if when they find things like this, if they don't hold on to them until something bad is happening so they could take our attention away and say, oh, yeah, I know the president did this, but hey, look what we found.
Well, Mike, I wouldn't understand why the government would be releasing this new information. Everything is going so well in the world.
Well, that's true. It is. It's just
they have nothing to distract us from.
No, we're in the Garden of Eve here.
Yeah, so, I view our push into space as one way to win eventually the war on terror, because we're going to change the subject.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're fighting about stuff that people have been fighting about for 1,000 years, that's not where we want to be. We want to be talking about new things. And so we're going to change the conversation. In a war of ideas, new ideas will triumph over old ideas.
Yeah. Now, how about the newest announcement from NASA? That is that the atmosphere was ripped away by a solar storm. Is that what they're saying?
Well, you have to take that with several large grains of salt. Get your salt shaker out, Mike.
Yeah.
In fact, unscrew the top from your salt shaker.
Yeah.
What they basically found is that Mars' atmosphere is being sandblasted away by the solar wind. And that doesn't surprise anybody because Mars doesn't have a magnetic field like the Earth. The magnetic field acts like a big force field to protect the Earth's atmosphere from this. But they have no idea how this process occurs in detail. All they know is that Mars is losing some of its atmosphere now. So they've taken 3 years of data and extrapolated it back 3 billion years. When your stockbroker does this, if your stock has gone up for the last 2 weeks, he tells you it's going to go up forever, right?
Yeah.
And you don't believe him. You shouldn't believe him because here's the reason we should add an enormous amount of salt to this pronouncement. The planet Venus is much closer to the sun, gets much more severe solar storms and solar wind, and yet it has a very dense atmosphere.
That's true.
And it has had one ever since for 4.5 billion years. So basically the reason Venus has such a dense atmosphere is I'm a plasma physicist by training. Plasmas have a mind of their own. And when you get a dense atmosphere, like was on Mars in the past, and is right now on Venus, what happens is the plasma in the outer part of the atmosphere generates its own magnetic field to protect the atmosphere. Just like a big generator. It takes the solar wind and turns it into a giant solar dynamo and it generates its own magnetic field.
And so
that's what Venus generates its own magnetic field to protect its atmosphere, only it does it with its atmosphere.
Well, Doctor, it's just like they tell us that our SUVs are warming up the planet here, yet they don't, are there SUVs on Mars?
Well, let me tell you something. This is the honest-to-God truth. I consider myself a political conservative. I am all in favor of free enterprise, and I am a registered Republican voter. And I believe that global warming is occurring. I think we are messing with the Earth's environment. But I say we have the solution to this, and that is we're going to have to shift to nuclear power. And much cleaner and safer forms of nuclear power are available now. So we're going to solve this problem with E equals mc squared.
But
now on Mars, something else happened. Like it wasn't SUVs that caused Mars to be Mars.
Right, but I want to add in that it's come out that the data on the global warming has been fudged, and that and I'm not denying that there is some kind of climate change going on. There are changes.
Scientists have been fudging data to win arguments ever since science was invented.
I know.
So Mike, please do not. I hope you're not deeply shocked to discover that some scientists may have fudged the data in order to make their political soapbox a little bit higher. The problem is we have the solution to the energy crisis now because we have fusion energy that we can generate, and we can mix fusion energy and fission energy, which we have already, and make a much cleaner form of nuclear power called hybrid nuclear power. The energy crisis is actually solved, all except for the economic and political questions involved. So it's and by the way, all science, especially when it's important, when we're talking large amounts of money being involved, becomes political and economic, especially at Mars.
Right.
By the way, we're going to solve the energy crisis on Earth, and we're not going to solve it with a bunch of windmills and solar power plants either. Those can only provide a few percent of what we need.
I think that if they would stop suppressing the technologies that could be existing right now, because I think it is solvable. I think it's been solved.
I see, Mike. I agree with you. We can solve this problem scientifically and technically. It's just a matter of getting the political ducks in a row to solve it. There's the fossil fuel industries who, and we digress. We're talking about Earth. Let's talk about Mars.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what everybody's listening for. People are tired of hearing about this planet. They want to hear about Mars.
That's right, because Mars has a chance. I'm not sure how much of a chance the Earth has.
Well, let's say Mars is a whole new planet where the Earth, the human race has a whole new chance to do things right.
Yeah.
Because I'm laughing. No, the reason we're going to go to Mars, Mike, is because we have to go. Now, I've just posted new data on my website, lifeonmars.pub. I sent you a link.
Mm-hmm.
Where we found a new carved artifact. We call it the Aztec head, and a lot of people have been discussing it. We found a second picture of the Aztec head. Remember, Jet Propulsion Lab, you got to understand the space program. Space program is strongly divided between people who want to explore everything in the universe robotically and ultimately replace the human race itself with robotics. And the people who want to launch the space cowboy crowd, wants astronauts to go up and explore. And face it, Mike, until you plant a human being someplace, we haven't been there.
That's right.
You can. I got one person really mad at me. In fact, I've been checking my car hood ever since. I put tape on it to make sure nobody put a bomb under it. Because we were debating at a scientific conference, and he was arguing that we ought to send. We don't ever need to send astronauts to Mars. We can send robots. And I said, well, that's kind of like saying phone sex can be as good as the real thing. Oh, did he get mad at me when I said that? I have to be careful sometimes. We have to send people there because people can do in-depth investigation. We're driving that rover around on Mars, and we're taking pictures of interesting things. Finally, Murphy's Law caught up with Jet Propulsion. Jet Propulsion Lab doesn't want to find any dead civilization on Mars. They're a bunch of rock geologists. The joke is that if you were driving along with the rover and saw an interesting rock with a Martian lizard sitting on top of it, they would use the robot arm to chase the lizard away so they could look at the rock.
Yeah, you're right.
When you ask the hard rock geologists why they did that, they will say these guys are wearing pocket protectors with their whole shirt pocket full of pens, and he will say, the lead rock geologist will say why he chased the lizard away so he could look at the rock. He says, the rock will tell me more.
Well, Doctor, we use that same kind of philosophy here in radio. There are radio hosts out there who will overlook the truth so that they can continue to get their funding too. It's true.
Oh well, the human race has always had trouble with being truly objective when its own livelihood is at stake.
That's right.
And I don't. if I was at Jet Propulsion Lab and a member of the staff there, I would probably be, I'm kind of the sort of person I am, I'd probably be very loyal to them and would curse 3 times every time I saw a picture of the face on Mars. And because, for one thing, I would say, if this thing turns out to be true, all the planet Mars is going to be transferred to Houston, Texas, to a bunch of people wearing cowboy boots and big hats. And I won't get to do any more science there. Now, that's not true. But one of the people I talked to who was retired from Jet Propulsion Lab said that a senior manager told him that, he said, we know if we find anything exciting on Mars, the astronauts will come with their big rockets and take Mars away from us. And that's what's going to happen. The astronauts are going to take over Mars. Houston is going to run Mars instead of Pasadena. I'm not talking Pasadena, Texas. Pasadena, California is going to have to give up Mars to Houston, Texas. And it's going to be Houston, Mars 1 has landed. Now that has to be because of what we have found on Mars. We have found, in a nutshell, that Mars used to be Earth-like in the past and became eventually the home not only to life, but a humanoid civilization, and that civilization was apparently destroyed by a nuclear attack from space. And we have to send astronauts there to find out what exactly happened. Did the people on Mars know who did this to them? And how can we make sure that this doesn't happen to us? It may be that the most dangerous thing in the universe to intelligent life like ourselves is other intelligent life. So that's why we have to send astronauts to Mars, because we must maximize our knowledge of what happened. Anyone who's done archaeology will tell you you have to dig. You have to have people with shovels and sieves digging up things and with sharp eyes and finding things in the dirt. We're going to have to go up and find out how much of a civilization was there, what was this level of advancement. It looks primitive. It looks like the face in Cydonia and the tian pyramid, which were the 2 biggest artifacts that the Sidonian civilization left. Based on an Earth reference, it looks like it was a primitive civilization. We don't find the evidence of roads, airports, anything of that nature indicating a large-scale civilization. However, the civilization appears to have been massive. We found what looks like ruins of a city near the tian pyramid, and it goes on for miles. Imagine not Pompeii in Italy or Machu Picchu in Peru being excavated, but imagine something 100 times larger. So the pictures are now posted with the frame numbers, so you can verify them for yourselves, are now posted on my website, lifeonmars.pub.
Okay, and I have been putting a link in the chat room, and we also have it posted on our homepage at the website, latenightinthe-midlands.com.
We actually have now 3 very good images of this city, what appears to be the ruins of a city, and it is massive. It looks like it had millions of people in it. So, but at the same time, it does not look advanced. It looks primitive. And so it's even more sad that we have now more and more evidence of that the enormous nuclear explosions occurred on Mars. They apparently occurred at 2 places. On the lifeonmars.pub and elsewhere, you'll see maps of where the nuclear explosions occurred. And anyone who can read a map can tell you that, can can see that given the prevailing winds on Mars, the fallout and the blast, most intense blast, would have gone downwind to Cydonia Mensa and another place called Galaxis Chaos, which it's a NASA-assigned name. We did not come up with this name. But it's a very sad. My first reaction when I saw these new pictures showing the city was great sadness, because the magnitude of the extinction of a humanoid species was apparent to me.
And Doctor,
populated area.
Quickly, if I may, I just want to direct people, that link I've put in the chat room, click that, and then you'll see right up at the top of his website, right under the banner where the tabs are, you'll see new data from Mars, new images, and it talks about the Cydonia city and such. And click that, and that'll take you over, and I'm even going to get the link from that, and I'm going to post that in the chat room now too.
This is just a start. This is a developing thing. We now have 3 good images of this city, and it's enormous.
That's incredible. That most certainly is. You can see.
We're talking something like ancient Rome or Babylon. Just an enormous city, and all which would have been the home to millions of persons.
Incredible.
So when we're talking a planetary massacre, we're talking a real massacre. And the reason, by the way, we know that massive nuclear explosions occurred on Mars is because of the nuclear isotopes found in the Martian atmosphere. There'll be more data put up on the website soon, and I'm going to be presenting a paper at the Lunar Planetary Science Conference. We've found what looks like supernova isotopes on Mars, and those are either made in a supernova or in a nuclear explosion on Earth. And so we found a good match between what scientists agree is supernova xenon made by a supernova, and Martian xenon. So we're doubling down on the evidence for the vast nuclear explosion on Mars. We found that the explosions turned large areas of Mars to molten glass, and they didn't make craters, they were airbursts. That means whoever made these explosions did not they fell, these weapons fell from space. They were not made on Mars and set off on Mars. That would have made enormous craters in the ground. Instead, they were set off in midair, probably 100 miles up in the sky. So this was done by a spacefaring species, and
wouldn't that in fact be what's disintegrating the atmosphere there? Or it probably has.
Well, you know that. See, one of the things that you have to do is you say, okay, if we can't explain, like the isotopes on Mars, in terms of a natural process, can we explain them in terms of a known process? You say, okay, we can't explain this in terms of any natural thing, except a supernova going off on Mars, and that didn't happen because it would have blown up the rest of the solar system too.
Right.
So it wasn't a supernova. It was something like a supernova, which is a hydrogen bomb. That's the closest thing in nature to a supernova, is a hydrogen bomb. And so they In fact, they tested a lot of models for what would happen in a supernova in hydrogen bombs. So they have some idea of what the processes are in a supernova and a hydrogen bomb. So there's a meteorite called the Allende. It fell in Mexico, and which is kind of ironic because the objects, the faces, the objects on Mars, the artifacts, look like they're from old Mexico. They look like they're products of the Olmecs or the Aztecs. And then this meteorite fell in Mexico at a place called the Allende, and it was the largest meteorite that ever was recovered. It was recovered in pieces, and it has isotopes in it that they agree were created in a supernova, and it matches Mars.
Jeez.
Well, here, I'll tell you something. This data, the only thing that matches Mars' atmosphere is what everyone agrees is a result of a supernova. And that has been sitting in the literature for 40 years, along with the Mars data, and no one has ever publicly pointed out, gee, Mars looks like it had a big supernova on it.
Which would be, what, 2 nuclear explosions? Is what?
2 nuclear explosions, yes. Everybody knows that if there wasn't a supernova on Mars, it would have blown up Mars and the whole solar system. It has to have been something like a supernova, which is a hydrogen bomb explosion. So everyone has known this for 40 years, but being scientists, they just couldn't connect the dots. They were afraid to. In fact, I've told people, I said at the Secret Space Program conference, I said, Mars presents the human race with a Darwinian intelligence test, and so far we are failing it. Scientists cannot connect the dots because the resulting image is so terrifying. It's too terrifying to accept. The idea that there's forces out there that could come along, find a primitive civilization sitting on Mars, and drop 2 enormous hydrogen bombs on it.
Well,
bombs so big that they just destroyed the whole atmosphere. They didn't just wipe out the civilization; they sterilized the planet.
Well, Doctor, the fact that we have those weapons here I'm wondering if some of those people aren't, still fugitives on this planet.
I'm sure if I asked some people who caused this, they would say it was the U.S. government.
Well, yeah, very well could have been.
This happened a long time ago, Mike.
Yeah.
This happened about a quarter billion years ago.
Yeah, and
that's our best estimate.
And we're talking nuclear weapons.
There weren't any human beings around to do this.
Well,
human
not on
beings,
Earth.
as we know them, are off the hook on this one. This is one thing that I remember I worked at a scientific place, and there was a fire. I remember walking out, and I've always been known as kind of an unusual character, so I was just walking out of my office, and everyone looked at me like Brandenburg must have somehow caused this fire. Because they knew I did some interesting experiments, in labs. I was very careful. So, and I just looked at him and I said, "No, you can't pin this one on me. I was just sitting in my office."
Hey, I've got an interesting.
I was just sitting in my office working some equations, and then somebody pulled the fire alarm, and it turns out somebody had been boiling wax. On a stove and had forgotten about it. So anyway, it was fine. They put it out with a fire extinguisher. But then we got to see all the fire trucks arrive anyway.
Well, good. And Doctor, I've got a question here from the chat, which I usually save these for later, but this is a good one.
Okay, great.
Surf says he asks if the asteroid belt could have been a planet and it exploded near Mars, and could that have caused this to happen on Mars?
that appears very unlikely. If you take all the asteroids in the asteroid belt and add them all up, you don't get anything. You only get something about the size of the moon.
Ah.
So it's certainly possible, but most scientists don't favor that idea simply because there just isn't enough stuff in the asteroid belt to make anything very big. Now, it's an interesting idea, and I think we should be open to ideas like this, given this quite amazing and kind of frightening thing we found on Mars. In fact, one person said, could it have been that there was a planet in the asteroid belt where the asteroid belt is now, and Mars, and it had a war, and the planet in the asteroid belt lost? So it's a very interesting idea, and many people have proposed this. But right now, and it's simply because if you add up all the asteroids, there's just something only the size of the moon. So there's not enough there to make a planet, unfortunately.
Okay, good. I've got, I'm just going to hit them because these questions kind of refer to what we're talking about now.
Hey.
All right, Tomato Picker asks, Michael, could a flyby from a second sun do this devastation to Mars? So I guess a Planet X type object is what they're referring to.
That's also a very interesting idea. There is, of course, the hypothesis of Planet X or Nibiru that would come sweeping through the solar system every once in a while. Anything the size of another star. See, the problem is what happened on Mars was a nuclear event. It was 1 billion megatons of energy release. And the Martian atmosphere is just full of the residues, the same residues that they found on Earth after nuclear tests. Mars' atmosphere is loaded with them. And the interesting thing is, though, none of the other planets seem to have been affected. So if a star went through the solar system, it would have stirred up the whole solar system.
I see.
And the isotopes on Earth, Jupiter, the Moon, from asteroids, from meteorites that come from the asteroid belt, and from the solar wind, all match a kind of standard baseline. Mars sticks out like a sore thumb. So whatever happened was absolutely concentrated on Mars.
Okay, and there's a question here about Mars moon, and questions about whether it's artificial and was brought there. But I guess, how do we know that unless we can actually go there? What do you think?
We should send astronauts and land on it and see if that's true.
I agree.
That's what I say. And, that's really the only way to settle that, because we know that the moon of Mars, Phobos and Deimos, it has 2 moons, and they're ready-made space stations. All you have to do is just go up and dock with them. You don't really land on Deimos or Phobos. And Phobos is just a made-to-order space station. It's a great place for a base camp for landing on Mars. And so you have to, but it's covered with dust and micrometeoroids and gravel and stuff. So if it's a space station, the only way to do is to send some astronaut with some brooms and shovels and dig down and see if they find metal.
Yeah.
That would be nice, because then we have a big space station for us.
Well, that would be nice, but, would they tell us? That's another thing. I mean, they waited, how many years to tell us about water?
Yeah, well, you got to put yourself in the government's shoes. I know it's hard.
It is.
But there are a lot of people who are very religious in this country. This country is probably the most religious country on Earth, next to maybe India or someplace like that. And a lot of people who are religious, very religious, and I'm religious. I'm just an Episcopalian, but I'm a believing Christian. When I was younger, and I was a fundamentalist, the idea of extraterrestrial life was very disturbing to me. And I was told from the pulpit that there was no such thing, that would complicate God's plan for everything, and that it was considered foolish to even be interested in such subjects. So, ultimately I had to choose between the way of science and being a fundamentalist. I chose to be a scientist, but I'm still a Christian. I'm just an Episcopalian.
Well, you're open-minded, and you know that there's more to the story, and so.
Oh well, it turns out that I wrote a part of what happened to me, Michael, is when I discovered that we couldn't really explain what had happened on Mars, given the data that we had. The picture it painted when we connected all the dots was pretty awful. It suggested that somebody come along, like the Death Star in Star Wars, and just blown up Mars. Only they did it with big nuclear weapons. They didn't use the Death Star. And that made me so sad that I found myself slipping into a depression. And I struggled against that by I decided I would write a book about, I wrote a book called Cosmic Jesus. And as it turns out, I addressed this question of what should be the believing Christian's attitude about extraterrestrial life. As it turns out, no, God didn't tell you everything. Except if you read the Bible in the original Greek. And there, it is clear as crystal, there's extraterrestrial life. And the reason is when Jesus tells his disciples to go out into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, that's in Mark, the word that is translated as world in the King James Bible is the word cosmos from the Greek. The New Testament, it was written in Greek. And everywhere you find the word world, for God so loved the world, he ever gave his only begotten Son, that's John 3:16, it is the Greek word cosmos. The Greeks had a very sophisticated understanding of the universe 2 centuries before Jesus even walked the earth. They knew the earth was round, they knew it was a planet, they knew that it moved around the sun along with the other planets. They knew that the other stars were probably other suns with planets around them. They knew all of these things. In fact, one philosopher even told Alexander the Great that there were other planets with people on them, and Alexander the Great wept when he heard this. He said, I can't even conquer this planet, he says. So the ancient Greeks, 200 years before Jesus, had a deep understanding of the cosmos. They had a word for the world, which was just G, as from geology. They hardly ever use that in the Bible. If you look at the Bible in the Greek, when it says, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, that is the word cosmos. 85% of the time when it uses the word world in English, in the King James Bible, it's a translation of the Greek word cosmos. So it is clear as crystal, if you read in the original Greek, that God is telling the human race that there is much more than this earth that he is concerned with. So, no Christian should be upset by the fact that they're finding life on other planets. They're finding life on Mars. They've already found it, basically.
Yeah.
They've already found it, but it's not official yet. So one of these days, it's going to be official. You're going to wake up one morning. The discovery of a nuclear massacre on Mars means that the rest of the cosmos, to the fundamentalist Christian, is under sin. It is a fallen cosmos. It's not sugar and spice and everything nice out there. There's not a kinder and gentler universe. It's the rest of the universe is just as messed up as this planet is.
Yeah, I would guess
and
that
that's a hard thing for people to grasp. They want the rest of the universe to be kinder and gentler, wiser and more noble than this planet. And this thing on Mars shows you that it isn't. The rest of the universe can be a really rotten place, just like this planet. And so that's why, in particular, we have to. You have to. It says in Corinthians, it says, Paul writes, he says, when I was a child, I thought as a child, and then I became a man. I put away childish things. We have to put away childish things now. We have to face up to the universe the way it is. The universe is dangerous, as dangerous as it is beautiful. And we have to become spacefaring. We have to send astronauts to Mars. We have to build a moon base. We have to expand our space station. We have to become Captain Kirk and the crew of the Enterprise.
See,
we have to become Star Trek.
And what concerns me is, what most of us do, the smart ones anyways, is we learn from our mistakes. And if we do not know the true history, how the heck can we ever learn from it?
Well, I want you to know something. When we discovered this nuclear massacre on Mars, the first place we reported it was the Pentagon. And they told us to go ahead and publish it.
Really?
Yes.
Well, that's surprising.
I know, it's astonishing.
It is. I'm shocked.
But you must realize something. No, Uncle Sammy doesn't tell you everything. God doesn't tell you everything either. Nobody in their right mind tells everybody everything.
Well, I can attest that
no government on Earth tells its people everything it's up to. It just that is part of the role of government. Part of the role of government is to figure out problems and try and fix them sometimes before they become publicly known. Sun Tzu in The Art of War, it's written 200 years before Jesus, says the good physician cures diseases before anyone even knows they are sick. So here's the situation. The U.S. government has known that there was probably a massacre on Mars since 1976. And it has decided that it's now time for this to come out. And it's coming out.
It is time.
It is time.
Absolutely.
It is time. It's my understanding that, we've made several breakthroughs in space propulsion that will be rolled out probably in the next couple of years, like gravity modification and things like that. You're going to find out that the human race has more space technology than we ever gave them credit for.
And I wouldn't be shocked.
No, you wouldn't be shocked. So, as it turns out, the government has decided that this is going to come out. So it's coming out. And, like I said, we reported to the Pentagon after sitting on it for 6 months. They just came back with the message, and, typical of them, they phrased our question back to us as a question. We said, well, what are we supposed to do about this? And they said, why don't you publish it? So they want this to come out. Remember that the U.S. government revealed there was life on Mars.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't some university. It was the U.S. government at NASA revealed that there was, microfossils in the Martian rocks. I've seen their data, their latest data. It's solid. They're going to get the Nobel Prize eventually. But the people who have been attacking them have been a bunch of people from universities who don't like the idea.
Well, then, Doctor, it's safe to say then, that once that comes out, then there's no limit. There's going to be there's life everywhere.
Once Mars is the first Earth-like planet in the universe that we can look at, really examine closely. And we're examining it. We've been examining. The U.S. government has spent, probably $100 billion on Mars. And basically we found that Mars was Earth-like in the past, and it had life on it. And it still does have life on it. A tiny remnant of what it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And the U.S. government has told you this. When the U.S. government tells you they found liquid water on Mars, if you read between the lines, that means, there's life on Mars. There's life on Mars now. They've already told you there was life on Mars in the past. That was the U.S. government. The people who didn't like this are the people who want to do robotics for everything. The university types.
Yeah.
Mars is a big sandbox for them, and the idea that they're going to have to, that sandbox is going to be taken away and given to somebody else, a bunch of cowboys with, cow manure on their boots and cowboy hats and down in Texas, that's just impossible. It's just intolerable. By the way, I've been in both government labs and academia, and I can tell you that some people in the academic realm, they get one idea in their head, and they will not depart from it. In fact, Max Planck, who invented quantum mechanics, said that science actually advances by funerals, he says. He says, you never really win arguments. Your arguments, your opponents basically die or retire, and you quit hearing from them.
Yeah, well, it's a shame. It is. I mean,
people are stubborn, Mike.
I know. Oh, I know. They're stubborn even in my business.
I even admire stubbornness in people. Even people I wish would change their minds. I admire their stubbornness.
Well, I just want to be next to those people when the first ET just lands and says, yep, hey, we're here.
I have seen scientists do U-turns right in front of audiences. And I actually was part of I describe in my book, Death on Mars, my initiation to what real science was like in the big leagues. And because I was hired to work on a project at a big government lab. We were trying to fire lightning bolts through the sky, like laser beams, only we couldn't get them to fly straight. So I said we should spin them like rifle bullets so they would, fly straight. And another scientist said, oh, no, that would be the exactly wrong thing to do, yada, yada. So we got in this big argument, and I won the argument. And then I was forced to leave. I was told that something really bad was going to happen to me if I hung around in that place. Because there were hard feelings about me winning that argument. And and I actually got to see one of my most adamant, stubborn opponents do a scientific U-turn in front of everybody and make it sound like it has been his idea all along. So it would have been hilarious if it wasn't so kind of scary at the same time, because he did this scientific U-turn in front of everybody at this one meeting, and no one pointed out, well, Bill, you've been saying exactly the opposite for the last 2 months. No one even said anything about that he was contradicting his statements from the last 2 years. And I turned to a guy and said, does this mean I've won or I've lost? And the guy said to me, look around you, it looks like you've lost. now his idea.
Yeah.
So you got to realize science in the big leagues is like professional basketball. It's not supposed to be a contact sport.
Well,
but,
you know,
look in the playoffs under the net, the knees and the elbows are flying.
That's right. And you know, me myself, if you got to give somebody else the credit, as long as it gets the truth out there, then so be it. You know?
Oh, well, example is the Mars ocean. I stood up in front of an audience of 1,000 scientists and presented the evidence for the Mars ocean. They won't give me any credit because of Cydonia.
Uh-huh.
They said, oh, it's our idea all along. But like you said, Mike, my satisfaction is if at least Wikipedia got it right. They give me first credit. They give me reference number 1. If you look on the Wikipedia page for Mars ocean hypothesis, reference number 1 is John Brandenburg.
Well, good. Rightfully so.
And, you know, I'll be vindicated eventually. But the important thing is that we were successful in having putting the idea of an ocean on Mars in the past. Oh, pardon me, my nose is getting a little stuffy. So that's real science. I'm fortunate that I got an education in real science just at the same time I was doing the Mars investigation. I became involved in the original Mars investigation. What happened is Vince DiPietro and Greg Molinar did superb work on investigating Cydonia. And Dick Hoagland got interested in their work and organized the independent Mars investigation team. He got together a bunch of scientists and engineers with the idea that we would verify the work of Gregory, investigate and verify or refute the work of DiPietro and Molinar, and we verified it all. And we went on further, and that's how the Mars ocean was discovered, actually, was in the process of the Cydonia investigation. We went to the case for Mars 2 and presented our data, and our paper was well received. And part of the paper was, that there appeared to be an old ocean shoreline at Cydonia, and it was the northern polar ocean. And we were, people really liked the idea. And one scientist told me, why don't you just publish just the Mars ocean idea, separate from Cydonia? So I did. Mm-hmm. And at a conference, and everyone picked up on it, and now it's become an established idea. It's now considered the truth. And that's very satisfying to me, even if they don't give me credit. Simply because it's impolitic. I can see that the politics of this scientific dispute. We're talking. This has been going on, Mike, since 1980. This has been going on since. They took the picture in 1976. It didn't have an impact till around 1980. And then by about 1984, it's just like a little spark starting a fire and finally turning into a forest fire. By the time 1984 came along, this thing became a full-fledged forest fire and became a big scientific war, and it has raged now since 1984, and that's 30 years, a generation. My youngest kids were not born when this thing started, and now they're grown up and off to college.
Hey, Doctor.
And you think I'm going to give up? No, I'm stubborn. Stubborn.
Well,
I'm more convinced I was right. Oh, and the trend of data is in our favor. By the way, I have so many interesting things to do as a scientist. I would not be doing this unless I was absolutely convinced at this point that we were right. Simply because, as a scientist, you learn fairly quickly what is a good path of scientific inquiry and what isn't. And so this has just turned into a gold mine of scientific discovery for me. And where the new discovery is that they have a meteor that everyone knows about that they call supernova, that is full of supernova isotope xenon, and it matches Mars. And those two things have been sitting in the literature right beside each other in journals for about 40 years, and no one has said a peep about it until now.
Well, Doctor,
saying a lot more than a peep about it. I'll tell you that.
Hold that thought. We've got to get a break in here, and then we'll come back and talk some more. So hang on.
The U.S. government has a permanent space colony in orbit around the Earth right now. It's called the space station. And that is basically it. We went to the moon. We beat the Russians to the moon. We did 6 victory laps. I mean, it was quite a goalpost dance. And then we withdrew from the moon because we didn't see anything terribly valuable there, and we were afraid of destabilizing the Cold War by building a base there. It was, there wasn't enough money, and there was no there was no big payout to having a base on the moon. There was no gold there. There was no water. There was nothing. So we don't have any bases on Mars. I mean, I worked with the space program for 30 years, and I worked with the Pentagon too, so I'm familiar with both sides of the space program, the public part and some kind the classified part.
Well,
and
Doctor,
it's all centered on Earth.
And Doctor,
the only people with bases on the moon that I've ever heard of is the Greys.
Well, yeah, I've heard of those too. But now
they are not our friends, by the way.
yeah. Well, one might say, and I'm sure
there's on their forehead says "does not play well with others."
Well, I'm sure there's listeners now, Doctor, who would say, well, maybe he just can't tell us that there's bases on Mars. Now, I'm not thinking that way, but I know there's some out there who are. So that it's just
well, I certainly haven't. I have never seen any or heard any evidence from any source that I believed that we had bases on the moon or on Mars.
Well, I trust you.
And the only people I've heard of, the only people I've had rumored that we have bases on the moon are the Greys, and they are not our friends.
Well, no, they're not our friends. So no bases. But could there be any? Do you think there could be any survivors that we haven't, on Mars? Like some underground.
And these are what's called famous last words. Based on our model, this looks like a civilization. It was just Stone Age. It looks like the Mayans. It looks like the ancient Egyptians. We don't think, it doesn't look like anything was advanced there. Now, we could be very wrong. We'll have to dig through the ruins. There could be advanced technology buried in the ruins. That's why the United States has to get up there first, just to be sure. But there is no evidence for any advanced culture on Mars based on the data that I have seen.
I see. That's
a big, maybe there's data I haven't seen. I don't. Of course, there's data I haven't seen. And I said this at the Secret Space Program conference. It's kind of scary when somebody who's been lying to you continually suddenly starts telling you the truth. You think, in fact, I commented that watching them build the SLS, which is the Saturn V class booster we're going to go to Mars with, I told several colleagues it's actually frightening to see the government do something that makes sense.
Well, yeah, it would be. It would.
I mean, instead of being a billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar boondoggle like the space station turned out to be, they built it and redesigned it. In fact, if we hadn't built the space station with the Russians, it would have never gotten built because the Russians build things and launch them, whereas the United States has what's called analysis paralysis. We redesign things so many times that we end up with nothing but paper. And so to see the United States moving in a kind of very logical direct line path, just taking parts of the space shuttle, reassembling them like Tinker Toys into a new Saturn V, is kind of scary in the sense that most of the time when the U.S. government does something big in space, it's to keep the big aerospace giants busy, just in case we need them in case we have a war. So you have to keep them busy in between wars, doing things. But this time we seem to be actually doing something very purposefully. That is, we're building a Mars rocket.
Mm-hmm. And JJ asked, Mike, can you ask your guest if the Mars One project to colonize Mars by 2015 will be allowed to move forward, or will the government want to get there first? Well, it is 2015, so you might have the year wrong. I don't know.
He's talking 2025.
Yeah, I think so. I think he hit the wrong key.
I think. I think the fact that they've set such an aggressive time schedule is very good. Elon Musk. When Elon Musk starts launching rockets to Mars, the government will probably step in and say, well, you have to do that under the aegis of the U.S. government. Here's a badge. Here's a sheriff's badge to wear when you go to Mars. And I don't think the U.S. government will stop them. I think the U.S. government may, in fact, use that to build public support for a U.S. government mission to Mars. All of this is coming out because the government wants it to come out. And the U.S. government has to deal with cosmic realities. There's a saying that's been commonly is that governments can ignore realities, but they can't ignore the consequences of ignoring reality. One of the problems with ignoring reality is that other governments, if the United States government ignores reality, that there's a dead civilization on Mars, it was probably destroyed by another civilization, other governments will not ignore that reality. The Chinese and the Russians will be happy to go to Mars if we don't.
Yeah, I believe that. I absolutely do.
And if let's say for once in my life, I am actually wrong as a scientist. That's wrong several times as a scientist, but I don't talk about those very. Fortunately, it's never been about something really big and important. When I figure out that I'm wrong about something, I basically do what a good scientist does. He says, well, in the light of new data, I've changed my mind.
All right.
Now, on this thing, if I'm wrong and there is advanced technology buried in the ruins in Cydonia, then whoever gets there first could have a great strategic advantage.
Well, just like I would think that other countries would be.
The United States, you don't like the way the United States dominates the world. How about the Russians?
Well, why not the moon? How come nobody's trying to get there and set up camp? Because that would give you high ground.
The moon is.
Well, it's a good place to launch a missile.
It is. That's one of the reasons. See, the moon. Until they found water on the moon, they have to find the water. You have to land a probe on the moon and find some water, and show people that there's water there. Because right now it looks like a very inhospitable place.
Mm-hmm.
And but I was part of the Clementine mission to the moon, where we discovered the lunar poles had billions of tons of water ice hidden at the poles.
Yeah.
Now that was an adventure, and of course, the whole Clementine mission was pretty interesting because it was a Defense Department mission to the moon, and it was basically a recon,
mm-hmm.
a recon mission, and so we did a very active reconnaissance of the moon, front and back sides, and so anyway.
All right.
Interesting. And the government, U.S. government, has now a spy satellite orbiting the moon. It can read license plates on the moon.
Oh, I don't doubt that at all.
It's called the MRO, it's the LRO. It's the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter.
Mm-hmm.
And they have also a spy satellite orbiting Mars now. And these things are basically U.S. spy satellites. Modified slightly for a lunar mission, and they put bigger solar panels on it for the Mars mission because the solar. They put some heaters on it and a bigger solar panel, so it would work well near the moon.
Well, darn,
near Mars because the sunlight's weaker out there.
The NSA is moving on up.
Well, there's an organization that used to be so secret that even its name was classified. It's called the National Reconnaissance Office, NRO. So you can bet that anything that rhymes with NRO, like LRO or MRO, is run by the NRO.
Uh-huh. Hey,
the U.S. government has the National Reconnaissance Office surveilling Mars and the moon, and in fact, the NRO was so secret that nobody even knew its name, and the only reason its name became public was because they had been given all this money to build spy satellites to read license plates and see if Vladimir Putin was tying his shoes.
Yeah.
Morning, and they have satellites that can do that. Now they have them in orbit around the moon and Mars. And the NRO was completely unknown around Washington, D.C. It was so secret, and then what happened was they had been given all this money to build spy satellites, and they did it, but they had money left over. They had a budget surplus, so they put it in a cash kitty. And they decided they wanted a new building. So they built this extremely modernistic, flashy steel and blue glass building right by Dulles Airport. And everyone saw it. And people asked, who owns that flashy new building? And believe it or not, congressional staffers that were constantly going out to Dulles Airport kept noticing this flashy building, and it didn't have any name tag on it.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing led to another, and they found out that that the NRO had completely bypassed the congressional budget authorization process, and it built itself a building without asking permission.
No, it was probably still cheaper than Obama's vacations, I'm sure.
Well, so the beans got spilled big time.
Yeah.
I mean, these were the magic beans got spilled all over the Beltway.
Well,
they had big hearings, and the NRO got scolded, and its cover was completely blown by this because there was this big scandal. They spent $1 billion on a new building that they were supposed to use to build satellites with. Said they built, gold-plated drinking fountains. And
well, they used their lunch money for beer, did they?
Well, it was just a fancy new building, and they weren't supposed to have it. They were supposed to ask Congress before they built a new building, and they didn't. And so so the NRO's cover got blown, but now, Washington insiders wink whenever they hear the word Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter or Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. It just means the military intelligence have set up shop at the Moon and Mars. Mm-hmm. U.S. government military intelligence has basically set up and they're not being bashful about it either, by just naming the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter and the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, those names. It's signifying that this is your U.S. government intelligence tax dollars at work.
Well, John, they're making it easy for the aggressive extraterrestrials to just tune in and see what the hell we're up to, huh?
Well, this is a way to let's just say, hypothetically, that there was somebody on the far side of the Moon with bases. And they look up, and every 8 hours is this great big U.S. government satellite comes over and takes pictures of everything they do. So much so that they have to draw the window blinds in their bathrooms when it's over. And it's a, you ask yourself, why would anybody build a base on the far side of the Moon anyway in the first place? Why not build it on the front side? I mean, but as it turns out, these people are bashful. In fact, the rumor is they find us rather intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
So if they were intimidated before, they're even more intimidated now, because we're basically orbiting them and taking pictures of everything they do all the time. So we're living in a time when things are changing. The human race is moving out into space. I'll tell you, Mike, what's going to happen. This big discovery at Mars it's going to become mainstream. And it's going to become mainstream because the powers that be wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
Want to go to Mars? Well, the powers that be want to live too. I mean, the U.S. government can't go to Mars without telling its people a good reason why they're going to spend $1 trillion.
Maybe that's why they made all these great underground cities and bunkers and stuff, because maybe they did learn something from Mars and said, hey, maybe they're going to come back and do this again.
Well, they made all sorts of underground stuff during the Cold War. The Russians built underground cities, complete with nuclear reactors to power them. The Russians were going to ride out a nuclear war, with 1,000 men and women to go out and repopulate Russia again. And you think this government does crazy things?
Oh, they all do.
The Chinese government, basically, the Chinese were getting ready to fight a war with Russia, and they just honeycombed China with caves to ride out a nuclear war and try and save at least 1% of their population. The people who planned, the Russians and the Chinese both planned to survive nuclear wars, unlike this country that just basically said, well, we'll be destroyed and that'll be it. The Russians, Chinese, though, they actually tried as hard as they could to survive a nuclear war. And so what they did is they built a lot of underground cities, and let's just say that was common knowledge when I was working in Washington, D.C. And the United States itself built some large underground bunkers. So yes, Cheyenne Mountain, is one publicly known one. Mm-hmm. And in fact, they're reactivating it now.
I see.
So.
well, yeah, and
yeah. So like people, you know, people think the U.S. government, since it's the largest object around, is the craziest government on Earth. That is not true. There are far more delusional and crazier governments on this planet than the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm.
North Korea is basically a half underground civilization.
Well, yeah.
And so.
Well, I've got another question here. This one comes from Bear, and he says, "Would John have any comments on Area 51, captured spaceships, aliens? Has he ever been there?" So those are
no, never been there. You know what? I wrote a science fiction novel. I write science fiction under the pen name Victor Norgard. I'm going to play it really safe. I worked in Washington, D.C. for 15 years, and I had a lot of security clearances. So as to keep myself out of trouble, let me just say I decided to write a science fiction novel.
Yeah.
And it's called Morning Star Pass, The Collapse of the UFO Cover-Up. It's written under the pen name Victor Norgard. Don't tell anybody that I am Victor Norgard.
All right. Your secret's safe.
I'm trying to keep my identity secret from the secret government. Now, you can read all you like about underground bases and bases on the far side of the moon and the U.S. government playing a brutal game of geospatial, spatial political chess game with the Greys and the other species around here. I put that all in the novel. And I actually went and talked to a bunch of abductees, too, before I wrote the novel to get their take on all this. And in the novel, we have a lot of captured alien technology, and we've managed to duplicate some of it so that we have our own anti-gravity.
Mm-hmm.
And it, we have anti-gravity space. They're not very good spaceships. They can fly around in the Earth's atmosphere pretty well because they use jet turbines for power. And they have trans-atmospheric fighters to go up and they every once in a while shoot down a UFO just to scare them.
Well, I'll
Cold War in outer space. So what happens is these. I'll just give you the thing in a nutshell.
Okay.
Imagine that the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Imagine that recorded a historic fact that the U.S. government met in secret with the Greys and had this love fest, and that this is in the middle of the Cold War. Imagine that this actually happened, like in the movie Close Encounters, in absolute secrecy. And then the U.S. government was so pleased with their new friends from outer space that they let them move into the Devil's Tower as a base and put up a triple ring of razor wire around it to keep everybody away. And it's one of these situations where the U.S. government, in return for letting the aliens study us, they just said, well, we're going to abduct some people just to study them, and we'll return them safe and sound when we're done. So the U.S. government said, oh, fine, go ahead. And but the government in return expected to get all sorts of nice technology, like anti-gravity and fusion energy or free energy and the cure for cancer and death ray. It's the Cold War. and all of these good things from the aliens. But in the novel, this had happened 30 years ago, and the U.S. government basically didn't get anything of value.
Well, we never do, it seems.
And so, we basically got beat, just like the Indians signing treaties hoping to get guns and ammunition from the government. They got beads and blankets and firewater. Mm-hmm. And so the problem is it's a completely secret program with absolutely no oversight from anybody. It's so secret, not even the president knows what they're doing. In fact, the subtitle of the book is Absolute Secrecy Creates Absolute Power. And so this thing just goes completely haywire out in the darkness. And so what happens in Washington, D.C., and I know this from experience, is when a heavily classified program goes haywire, what happens is somebody leaks something to the press. So in this case, they leak it to these, of course, two beautiful news anchors who want to be taken seriously as journalists. They want to be known as just not pretty faces. And so they they get all these leaked government documents, and guess what? They bring down the UFO cover-up in 6 months.
That would be fantastic. Nothing would make me happier.
Just because they're very tough and they're very brave, and they, it's like the will of God is with them, and they bring it down. And when they bring it down in the book, there's an attempted coup d'etat by the secret government. And there's tank battles in the streets of Washington, D.C. between the forces loyal to the president and the secret government and the forces loyal to the Congress and the Constitution. And I won't tell you how it turns out.
Okay, yeah, they'll have to get the book, won't they?
In this novel, the stuff literally hits the fan big time. We're talking about 100 tons of manure hitting a giant fan running at high speed over Washington, D.C.
Well, I hope it's soon. I hope that I live to see. I feel like I'm gonna, but I hope I live to see.
You are. Yeah. It's all this Mars thing is the beginning. The government has known about this thing for a long time, but it had to wait till it had something, till it was holding something, before they revealed it.
Right. Well, Doctor, I want to hit a few questions here. We got a break that'll be coming up soon, so let me try to get a couple in here. We've got Michael in Australia, and his comment, I guess, in question would be, not very successful civilizations. Why hadn't they spread beyond 2 small areas of the planet if they were important enough to bother wiping out with nukes?
Tell Michael this is an excellent question.
All right. I think you just did.
Excellent question. And the truth is they actually did spread beyond 2 areas. It looks as though the entire coastal region, it's just like on Earth you have, if you go to the coast of Australia, you have Perth and Brisbane and Melbourne. You have some big cities along the coast, and so on Mars, they apparently had another place called Deuteronoilus that's about 1,000 kilometers rather, from Cydonia Mensa. It was also a center of civilization. It wasn't as extensive, and so we think there was a lot of cities spread around. We've only found, the only reason we found Cydonia Mensa and Galaxis Chaos is because they're big carved faces there. Yeah. There's one big carved face, and maybe a second one at Galaxis Chaos and the ruins of a city. And then there's, of course, at Cydonia Mensa, there's a pyramid and a face right next to it. So I mean, future generations are going to wonder why it took us so long to figure this out.
Well, because I don't think that some wanted us to figure this out, probably.
No, they didn't. No, people, it was so the answer to Mike's question is that there's a lot of stuff there that we just haven't been able to investigate because the imagery, which is our source of information, has been concentrated at Cydonia and Galaxis Chaos and a few other places. And the object called the Aztec Head, though, that's down where the Curiosity rover is. That's in a place called Gale Crater. It's on the shoreline of the ancient ocean. So it looks like there were settlements and cities all along the coastlines of the ancient ocean. And just look at a map of Mars that shows the ancient ocean outlines, and you can see there was a lot of area. So part of it is that the images have been concentrated at the places that were the most obvious, Cydonia and Galaxis Chaos. And even at Gale Crater, where they apparently were driving the rover around, hoping not to see anything, they by accident took a picture of this Aztec head thing that looks clearly to me to be a carved artifact. And it's not the only thing they've seen that looks like a carved artifact, but it's one of the most obvious ones. It's a big toothy idol. So it looks like something carved by the Aztecs. And so it's kind of there's an old joke that says, the man loses his wallet in the street, and they find him later looking under a streetlight for his wallet. And they ask him, they say, well, you had a bit to drink and you were wandering around and you've lost your wallet. Why are you looking under the streetlight? Do you think you lost it here? And he says, I don't really know. He says, this is the only place I can look, though.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, it's
the only place I can see anything. So I'm looking under the light, under the street light.
What about a time frame, John? What about a time frame on when this nuclear event may have happened? Somebody had asked that.
It looks as though it dates to when Mars was Earth-like. So it looks like it was about 500 million years ago to maybe 250 million years ago. This happened long before there were any humans on Earth. There were only cockroaches on Earth.
All right, and Frank in Buffalo says, according to some sources, we're probably the ones who did that to Mars. And I think you
God. No, it wasn't us.
No, but we may be from there. We may have escaped from there, though, huh?
Oh,
some of us, or brought here.
Like I said, I've talked to people who
Noah's ship
claim that they'll say in the same breath that that the U.S. faked the Apollo moon landings because and the real secret is that we have moon bases on the moon already. We've had them since 1600. And I said, but that's before there was even a United States. And they say the United States has always existed.
Yeah, on another planet, though, right?
Oh well, it's something like it's there. You have to, even if you're going to allow there's such a thing as good science fiction and bad science fiction. We're living in a science fiction movie now, Mike.
There is a lot of horse crap
but you
out
got to
there.
realize it's a good science fiction movie. In a good science fiction movie, the aliens do not have superhuman powers. They basically have better technology.
Right.
And in fact, like I read a lot of the UFO stuff, and that reads like good science fiction because the aliens are not bulletproof in the UFO reports.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think they bleed just like we would. And that's why I would.
Well, that apparently has been established many times over, and so in bad science fiction, the aliens arrive. They're all bulletproof. They are 10 miles tall, and et cetera, and have godlike powers.
Yeah.
And but in real life, everyone has limitations. Everyone has budget constraints.
Well, they have technology that makes it look like they have godlike powers to a primitive.
Yeah, and you've got to just keep a hold of yourself here. This stuff on Mars apparently happened before there were any human beings, much less the United States government. And
yeah,
I'm surprised that it wasn't the Bilderbergers or somebody who did it.
Well, don't now you put it out there. That'll be next.
Coming
to before it's news.
There's conspiracy theories involving the U.S. government are just now a cottage industry, and by the way, always have been. When my pop was in World War II, he said the big rumors was that FDR really knew that Pearl Harbor was going to happen and let it happen so they would get in the war, and that was what the conspiracy theory was. And the conspiracy theory about World War I was that the ammunition makers had started the war so they could sell more ammunition to both sides. So they've always been conspiracy theories, and you just.
Yeah, well, and for me, I say, okay, if something's possible, then it's possible, but I need to see some evidence before I can.
And you got to realize that it's very difficult for even a legitimate government to get anything done. I mean, going to the moon with Apollo was really hard to do, but we managed to do it. The Russians, however, despite their very best efforts, just did not have the technology to go to the moon. Their big moon rocket blew up. The reason was it had 42 engines.
Wow.
Their computers were poor, so they couldn't design. We used our superior computer technology to design 5 big engines for the Saturn V for the first stage. The Russian moon rocket had like 42 engines, small engines, because all they could build was small engines. And they ganged them together, and they started they got out of sync, so they started interfering with each other, and the whole thing blew up. So it was just all they could build was a very complicated thing with a lot of plumbing, and so the Saturn V was just a much simpler rocket than the Russian N-1. And if anybody knew that we went to the moon, it was the Russians, because they tracked everything we did.
Yeah, I would assume that if this stuff didn't happen, then they would be the first ones to scream and say, "Hey, you didn't beat us at nothing." So that's kind of the argument that kind of wins out with me right now. But the only other option is they're in it together, and so again, proof
Mike,
either way.
Take care of yourself. You're going to go to the moon.
Yeah.
We've got technologies that we're going to be rolling out in the next decade that'll make it easy to go to the moon. It'll be a day trip.
Oh, I'd love it. I'd love to go.
I really believe that, because I actually work on unified field theory.
And John, one more question before I have to go to this break, and that is, somebody told me last night that NASA said they have absolutely no video footage of the planet from space showing it rotating and all that, and that it's a globe. If we've been to the moon, how come we don't have that footage? Why haven't we?
That's complete nonsense.
It is? Okay. I thought it had to be, right? But that's what I'm being told.
Dash.
So
we have all sorts of movies of the moon. We have all sorts of satellites taking pictures of the Earth all the time, rotating, and the Apollo astronauts, had handheld video cameras, and they were pointing them out the window, watching the Earth rotate.
Well, my guest last night told me that he had actually called to see about paying for some copyright to use one for a movie, and he says that he was told that they don't have any footage like that. And I thought that was kind of, I don't see why we wouldn't.
A lot of the stuff they launch is geosynchronous, so it actually just it orbits at the same rate that the Earth rotates, so it just takes a picture of the one spot on Earth. So
okay.
that's but I
okay, well, I thought I'd throw it at
like
you.
I was on the Clementine mission, and we were constantly taking pictures of the Earth to make sure we knew where we were.
I don't suppose I should ask you.
So just to make sure that our navigation was right, we'd we were over the moon. We'd be orbiting the moon. We'd pop up over the moon and take a picture of the Earth just to make sure that we knew where we were at the right place.
And one of our listeners asked, well, where is there a link where we can see that? Because
just go Clementine Pictures.
Clementine Pictures. Okay.
Clementine Mission Pictures. Yeah.
All right, fantastic. Well, John, hang on with us for a moment. We're going to take this last break. Dr. John Brandenburg.
If somebody who doesn't like us has bases on the moon, there are reasons not to disclose that. It would scare everybody, and they'd want to know, why haven't we done something about it?
True.
And no government shows everything that it has. It's just part of the first principle of statecraft, and this government is no different than any other government that way.
Yeah.
I think that the U.S. government appears to be slowly breaking it to its population that we're not alone in the universe, and one of the big surprises is going to be there's a dead civilization on Mars, and somebody wiped it out. That's it's just me saying it right now.
Right.
But someday it's going to be official. And then somebody will say, is that official? And they'll say, yes, it is. And that's going to be very upsetting.
Right.
And we're the human race. There's a phenomenon in astronomy called Fermi's paradox, and it was first pointed out by Enrico Fermi, who was a really smart guy. He was famous among scientists for being able to find the right answer based on just a minimum of information. He was also the first person to make a nuclear reactor and paved the way for the first nuclear weapons. And he fixated, one day he's sitting down to lunch with Edward Teller, who is the father of the hydrogen bomb, and they're discussing extraterrestrial life. And Fermi points out that the human race is probably fairly typical of intelligent life in the universe. I mean, they've just been through World War II. They're racing to beat Joseph Stalin to build a hydrogen bomb, so the Russians won't have it first. They ended up beating them by just a few months. And basically Fermi says, look, the universe looks very fertile. They knew in those days there were probably planets around other stars. That was their best guess. They even had some, even back in the 50s, they had evidence from telescopes that there were planets, probably planets around other stars. So they had their first evidence of that. They also knew that the universe was a very fertile place. There was a lot of water and other chemicals necessary for life floating around out there. So Fermi, he also knew one other thing. So he knew the universe probably had lots of places to live and was a fertile place. And he also knew that the human race was not the first, probably not the first people in the universe. So he says if the human race is typical, the rest of the universe should be a very noisy place. There should be lots of people out there. Everywhere we point a radio telescope, we should be picking up soap commercials and political ads and on and on. All of the stuff that the human race blasts out into the universe this torrent of advertising and political ads, political debates, and if there was a civilization like us within 10 light years, we would easily be able to pick us up around another star. But the fact is that we point radio telescopes everywhere across the sky, and we find nothing resembling us at all.
Well, that's
very noisy, and yet the universe is apparently very quiet.
Well,
it's as quiet as a ghost town.
Well,
that's Fermi's paradox. He says, where are they?
Well, and that's like, NASA looking for green plant life, say, on Mars. I mean, we're looking for people who might be using radio technology when they may be...
Well, yeah, but we're using electromagnetism, and I can tell you from working on unified field theory, electromagnetism is really important.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're an advanced civilization, you make a lot of use of electromagnetism like we do, because that's the way the universe runs, on electromagnetism. And it runs on gravity and electromagnetism, basically. And, the key is figuring out how they relate to each other. But, so Fermi says, where are they? Where are all the other people? There should be hundreds of other civilizations out there filling the sky with nonsense like the Earth does. And they should be expanding all over. And yet it's quiet. Why is it so quiet? And a lot of people have tried to answer Fermi's paradox. On Mars, however, we may have the answer to Fermi's paradox, is that people out there are quiet because that's the smart thing, that's the smart play.
Yeah, they may have learned
if you are a primitive civilization, you do not attract attention to yourself, my friend. You try and make yourself real small.
Especially if you know somebody else is out there who's warlike. Could you imagine? I mean, that would be like us. Okay, there's riots going on in Baltimore, so we're going to hurry up, get in your car, let's drive right over there and get in the middle of it, right? So
right,
yeah. So
the rest of the universe may be quiet for the same reason Mars is quiet. Is there may be forces out there that look for primitive civilizations like ourselves that are really noisy and come and squelch us. So that's the reason we have to react to this. We don't have any time to lose. We have announced our presence. We have announced our presence to the rest of the universe by basically holding a rock concert, complete with we have basically held a nonstop Burning Man celebration here on Earth, complete with rock bands and big bonfires, and we've told the rest of the universe we're here. Now, if the rest of the universe is friendly or even indifferent, that's fine. But there could be some people out there, the same kind of people who destroyed Mars, who want to come here and get rid of us, figuring that it will just be trouble.
Well, and they could be looking at us from above and saying, we don't even have to blow these guys away. They're taking the pharmaceuticals and they're spraying and they're doing all these things to themselves. Let's just sit back and wait.
Well, yeah, I mean, some of them could be doing that. So we may have the answer to Fermi's paradox. There was a astronomer named Harrison who proposed this answer to Fermi's paradox. That the rest of the universe may be hostile to primitive, noisy civilizations such as ourselves, and gets rid of them, and like pulling up weeds.
Yeah.
And now that's not a happy thought. It's not a happy thought. But let's just say that, given what we found on Mars, we know that there are forces that could be quite hostile to the human race out there. And the Klingons are out there, for instance.
I know all about those Klingons.
Or somebody like the Daleks, in Doctor Who, determined to exterminate everybody. except themselves. And so we have to become spacefaring. And the more advanced we are technologically, the more, the more tough a nut we would be to crack for anyone coming here. And so who would mean us ill. So the way to maximize our chances for survival in the future is to go to Mars, maximize our knowledge of what actually happened there, and become spacefaring. We have to become the crew of the Starship Enterprise.
Right.
And I believe we can do that. I believe we can do it. We just put our minds to it, and that's what we have to do.
All right.
That's what I tell everybody. That's what this means.
Hello? And we have a call
We're doing it all. It just means we have to get going. Let's get going.
All right. And, Doctor, we've got a call. We've got 909 area code. First name, where you're calling from, please.
My name is Grant. I'm calling from Big Bear, California.
Well, welcome aboard, Grant.
Big Bear, California, West Coast. That's where I'm from. I'm from Oregon.
That's right, West Coast. Oh, right on, sir. So now, my main question now, I've been chimed in for a little bit now, is, so a lot of the things I feel like you were just saying, based on like aliens communicating with us, is based on the fact that like they're going, their species is developed the same way that we have in using technology and all that stuff. Now, what about for a species that has, developed differently, maybe communicates, not through sound waves and all of that stuff, you know what I'm saying? So really, like,
point.
What about aliens that can, then they have a completely different, like, totally different level of communication than what we do?
I'm sorry, and your name again?
He's Grant.
Grant, yeah.
Okay, Grant, your question is very good. Unfortunately, Grant, we only have one example of intelligent life in the universe. And what a fine example of behavior, well-behaved intelligence this is. I'm sure you would agree that the human race is a pretty rascally bunch.
Oh, indeed.
Most people ask the first question people ask me at scientific conferences when I present this data is, "Are you sure they didn't blow each other up? Blow themselves up?"
Yeah.
Because that seems much more reasonable than somebody else coming along and blowing them up, as they blew themselves up.
Indeed.
So, but your question is a very good one, and it's occupied. When I write science fiction, and I've tried to.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, and it's a good.
There's a lot of different areas that you can even you can think of. I mean, like, I feel like our science is very like our communication science is like very based on like like radio waves and like other like sort of like wave communication like that. But it's just like I mean, like, there's a lot of other different things that we can like take into consideration, like light. And,
right.
Like,
suppose to use ESP instead of sound waves.
And that could be a completely different wavelength than anything else. Now, if they were totally like regularly going to use that, and then maybe in the sense of progressed in the same way that we have progressed, into where that's their basic form of doing things. Now, we could be totally, trying to do the same exact things, but operating on totally different frequencies or whatever you want to say,
That's right. And then you're talking people with a much different social kind of structure than maybe we would have.
Oh, indeed. And, like, it'd be completely different at that point. But, that's...
Right. I'll tell you something, Grant. People have attacked my work on one hand saying, "John, what you propose is very boring." you've proposed people who behave just like us.
A little bit, actually. Yeah, you know. Yeah.
And I said, yes, that's. I said, yeah, that's true. So I'll admit to you, Grant. Yes, I proposed very boring aliens who behaved pretty much like we do, and I interpreted everything because, unfortunately, we are the only example we know of intelligence. Now, in the future,
but the base.
What's that?
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but...
No, I'm sorry. I was interrupting you. Continue.
To base all of our theories on only what we know is, like, very, very close-minded, I feel like. So,
and Grant, you are correct. It is very close-minded. I'll just say that my training as a scientist, I try to stick as close... When you're a scientist, you try to stick as close to the known as possible.
Yeah.
But now,
I get that.
I write science fiction. When I write science fiction, I don't feel inhibited by that, so I have people who are much different than we are.
Okay, well, in your field then, I mean, what do you do? I mean, not saying you're trying to, you're trying to receive all these communications. I'm not 100% sure. But then in your field, would you not want to have that sort of science fiction openness into trying to receive that? Or are we so based on what we know that that's what we're going to stick with? We're just sticking our guns on that one.
Yeah, see, what we found on Mars is we found, a big carved face and a big pyramid next to it.
Yeah.
And then we found evidence that Mars was like Earth with river channels and stuff. And so we kind of said, well, gee, we have pyramids on Earth, in Old Mexico and in Egypt. Yeah. And we have the Sphinx, and we have the Olmec heads, big heads and helmets carved by the Olmec culture.
Oh, yeah. I've seen those, like all the ancient astronaut carvings and all that. Yeah.
Very similar to the space in Cydonia. So you can see, Grant, where scientists are saying, this is a little bit like when people looked at Africa and South America and say, gee, they look like they fit together. People said, that's crazy. That can't be possible. But eventually, they realized, yeah, well, it may be impossible, but apparently that's what happened. Africa and South America used to be joined together in one continent. So what I'm saying is, for the purposes of presenting this as a scientist, as a scientific work, I have to stick to what kind of is known.
Okay, and Grant, thank you for the call too. But
Thank you, Grant. So your point is well taken, and yes, I have proposed kind of boring aliens and Martians and things, but I have to do that in order to kind of present a scientific case.
Well, and
science fiction, that's a different matter.
And Doctor, I would think that, as far as being a scientist, certainly you'll look outside the box, but as far as presentation, you can only really present the facts of what you know, right?
Exactly. You can only base things on kind of known data, one thing I do is I say, well, okay, we have this face and this helmet on Mars, and it looks like the Olmecs, something carved by the Olmecs, down to details. Now, that doesn't mean the Olmecs are on Mars. It just means that, it's not unknown for intelligent people to make stuff like this. It's right. Already demonstrated on Earth. And so it's just one of my I was presenting one new idea I had, just for energy, for fusion energy. And one fellow said to me, he says, "The problem with your idea, John, is it's not boring enough."
Well,
it has to be boring. It has to be boring to be funded. It has to look like a sure thing. In other words,
and I'm sure that there are civilizations well more advanced than us, but then, of course, I'm sure that there's going to be ones just like us too out there, and I think Mars could be an example of that.
Well, if you look at Star Trek, the Vulcans were very different from us.
Yeah.
But the Klingons were actually a lot like us.
Yeah, they were. They absolutely were.
The Klingons resembled certain people in history, like the Spartans or the Romans, even, and so they were a very militarily organized, blood and guts kind of bunch, and they were. But the Vulcan civilization was much different than us, and they viewed things a lot different than we did.
Right. Well, John, we're getting down on time here. So what I'd like to do, I mean, it's flown by, and it always does when I have great guests.
It always does, Mike, and it's so much fun to be on your show.
Well, I thank you, and I'd like to give you
thank all your people who send in questions and your caller. And it's been a great show.
Well, yes, it has, and we'll do this again soon. Now, websites, books, anything you want to throw out there, please, by all means, go ahead.
Well, just, the website has the latest data that I presented at the Secret Space Program conference, where it looks like we found a Martian city at Cydonia. It's near the pyramid. It's right at the base of the pyramid. And it goes on for miles, and it looks like ancient ruins on Earth. We've also found a new, what looks like a carved artifact by the rover, and we found a second picture of it. And of course, there's the book Death on Mars, which summarizes all of this, and it's a story of discovery, not just the discovery itself. And anyway, and it gives you some insight as to what it's like to be a scientist on the front lines of science, doing real science, not just storybook science.
Right. Well, John, thank you so much for being here tonight, and keep up the great work.
Pleasure.
All right, my friend. Well, until next time, thank you much, and have a great weekend. And
okay, you too. And there'll be more news later. We've got more scientific data, which we'll be presenting at future scientific conferences. And once I've got that, registered with the scientific conference and presented, be happy to return and explain to you what the new data is.
Yes, if it's all right with you, you'll be my Mars man. We'll start.
Okay. Very good. That has a good ring to it.
All right. Well, thank you again.
Sometime you can actually, we can talk about unified field theory too, which I also work on. In fact, I'll say one thing. Mars was kind of a diversion for me. I never thought I'd get involved in Mars. I always thought I would be involved in energy and unified field theory. So that's where I've actually focused a lot of my scientific work. So.
All right, yeah, well, we'll have to talk about that maybe next show.
Okay, very good.
All right, well, thank you again, and have a great night.
And good night to the Midlands.
All right, thank you. All right, everybody, Dr. John Brandenburg.
Molecular oxygen is the fourth most abundant gas in the Martian atmosphere. And the only way to make molecular oxygen under Martian conditions is to have photosynthesis. I've spoken to several scientists who have commented that, they don't want to be quoted, but they say this is indirect evidence of plant life on Mars simply because they can't explain how you would get molecular oxygen that abundant on Mars.
Right. What wouldn't they? And I'm not saying that they don't know this. So they probably would know this, but I mean, wouldn't they know? I mean, wouldn't they like see signs when they're orbiting around it? Wouldn't they see signs of?
I'm sure I've seen. I'm sure they've detected chlorophyll and organic compounds in some areas. They just haven't. You got to realize a lot of scientists, especially when the stakes are high, get very cautious. The brash young scientist out to save the world in the movies, that's more of an exception than the rule. Most scientists are very cautious. They're worried about tenure. They're worried about the department chairmanship. They're worried about, and you know, they have a career, and they're far more afraid of being wrong about something important than they are about making a big discovery. So they'll be very cautious, and they will assemble overwhelming evidence of something new and important before they'll make an announcement.
Or I wonder if when they find things like this, if they don't hold on to them until something bad is happening, so they could take our attention away and say, "Oh yeah, I know the president did this, but hey, look what we found."
Well, Mike, I wouldn't understand why the government would be releasing this new information. Everything is going so well in the world.
Well, that's true. It is. It's just
they have nothing to distract us from.
No, we're in the Garden of Eve here.
Yeah. So, I view our push into space as one way to win eventually the war on terror, because we're going to change the subject.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, if we're fighting about stuff that people have been fighting about for 1,000 years, that Hello.
Good evening, Dr. Brandenburg. How are you tonight? This is Michael Vera.
Oh, great, Mike. Great to be talking to you. Here, let me turn off the music here.
All right, great. So it sounds like you're just kicking back, having a good time, huh?
I am. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's good. Well, hey, welcome back to Late Night in the Midlands. And I apologize for all the rescheduling that we've had to do, but
Hey, nothing worth doing is done easily.
Oh, I'm telling you now.
If you're having difficulty doing something, it must be important.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're going to talk about tonight, I think, is very important. So a lot has happened since the last time you and I spoke. Water on Mars, and I'll say, Doctor, what say you?
Oh, well, this is only the 500th time they've discovered water on Mars, but it is now kind of official that there's liquid water on Martian surface, and that means there's life. It's a lead pipe cinch. Wherever you find liquid water on Earth, you find something alive in it.
Yeah.
So if you find liquid water on Mars, you're going to find living organisms flourishing in it.
I see, and
I think everyone understands that on an intuitive level now. I've talked to a lot of people who were kind of skeptics about the whole life on Mars business, and now a lot of them seem like they just concede, well, yeah, it looks very certain now.
Yeah, and they've known for a while, though, haven't they?
Yes, there's much other evidence for life on Mars, both past and present. There's, of course, the meteorite microfossils and magnetites, which people aren't paying any attention, but the academics have been doing trench warfare about that for the past 10 years, and the people from Houston have finally won. And by the way, realize that this is the U.S. government people from Houston, NASA Houston, who won a manned spaceflight mission. They're the ones pushing life on Mars. Also, most people don't realize, but that's not where we want to be. We want to be talking about new things. And so we're going to change the conversation. In a war of ideas, new ideas will triumph over old ideas.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, how about the newest announcement from NASA? That is that the atmosphere was ripped away by a solar storm. Is that what they're saying?
Well, you have to take that with several large grains of salt. Get your salt shaker out, right?
Yeah.
In fact, unscrew the top from your salt shaker.
Yeah.
What they basically found is that Mars' atmosphere is being sandblasted away by the solar wind. And that doesn't surprise anybody because Mars doesn't have a magnetic field like the Earth. The magnetic field acts like a big force field to protect the Earth's atmosphere from this. But they have no idea how this process occurs in detail. All they know is that Mars is losing some of its atmosphere now. So they've taken 3 years of data and extrapolated it back 3 billion years. When your stockbroker does this, if your stock has gone up for the last 2 weeks, he tells you it's going to go up forever, right?
Yeah.
And you don't believe him. You shouldn't believe him because here's the reason we should add an enormous amount of salt to this pronouncement. The planet Venus is much closer to the sun, gets much more severe solar storms and solar wind, and yet it has a very dense atmosphere.
That's true.
And it has had one ever since for 4.5 billion years. So basically the reason Venus has such a dense atmosphere is I'm a plasma physicist by training. Plasmas have a mind of their own. And when you get a dense atmosphere, like was on Mars in the past, and is right now on Venus, what happens is the plasma in the outer part of the atmosphere generates its own magnetic field to protect the atmosphere. Just like a big generator. It takes the solar wind and turns it into a giant solar dynamo, and it generates its own magnetic field. By the way, we're going to solve the energy crisis on Earth, and we're not going to solve it with a bunch of windmills and solar power plants either. Those can only provide a few % of what we need.
I think that if they would stop suppressing the technologies that could be existing right now, because I think it is solvable. I think it's been solved.
I see, Mike. I agree with you. We can solve this problem scientifically and technically. It's just a matter of getting the political ducks in a row to solve it. There's the fossil fuel industries who, and we digress. We're talking about Earth. Let's talk about Mars.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what everybody's listening for. People are tired of hearing about this planet. They want to hear about Mars.
That's right, because Mars has a chance. I'm not sure how much of a chance Earth has.
Well, let's say Mars is a whole new planet where the Earth, the human race has a whole new chance to do things right.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm laughing. No, the reason we're going to go to Mars, Mike, is because we have to go. Now, I've just posted new data on my website, lifeonmars.pub. I sent you a link.
Mm-hmm.
Where we found a new carved artifact. We call it the Aztec head, and a lot of people have been discussing it. We found a second picture of the Aztec head. Remember, Jet Propulsion Lab, you got to understand the space program. Space program is strongly divided between people who want to explore everything in the universe robotically and ultimately replace the human race itself with robotics. And the people who want to launch the space cowboy crowd, wants astronauts to go up and explore. And face it, Mike, until you plant a human being someplace, we haven't been there.
That's right.
You can. I got one person really mad at me. In fact, I've been checking my my car hood ever since. I put tape on it to make sure nobody put a bomb under it. We were debating at a scientific conference, and he was arguing that we ought to send. We don't ever need to send astronauts to Mars.
And so
That's what Venus generates its own magnetic field to protect its atmosphere, only it does it with its atmosphere.
Well, you know, Doctor, it's just like they tell us that our SUVs are warming up the planet here, yet they don't, you know, are there SUVs on Mars? You know?
Well, let me tell you something. This is the honest-to-God truth. I am consider myself a political conservative. I am all in favor of free enterprise, and I am a registered Republican voter. And I believe that global warming is occurring. I think we are messing with the Earth's environment. But I say we have the solution to this, and that is we're going to have to shift to nuclear power. And much cleaner and safer forms of nuclear power are available now. So we're going to solve this problem with E equals MC squared.
But
now on Mars, something else happened. Like, it wasn't SUVs that caused Mars to be Mars.
Right, but I want to add in that it's come out that the data on the global warming has been fudged, and that and I'm not denying that there is some kind of climate change going on. There are changes.
Scientists have been fudging data to win arguments ever since science was invented.
I know.
So Mike, please do not. I hope you're not deeply shocked to discover that some scientists may have fudged the data in order to make their political soapbox a little bit higher. The problem is we have the solution to the energy crisis now because we have fusion energy that we can generate, and we can mix fusion energy and fission energy, which we have already, and make a much cleaner form of nuclear power called hybrid nuclear power. The energy crisis is actually solved, all except for the economic and political questions involved. So it's and by the way, all science, especially when it's important, when we're talking large amounts of money being involved, becomes political and economic, especially at Mars.
Right.